Welcome to HFY Genesis. Today's story explores how humanity faced the impossible odds in When Deathworlders Finally Snap, No More Playing by the Rules. Let's dive into a galaxy where survival and revolution clash. The city lay in ruins beneath a darkened sky, its once vibrant streets now choked with ash and the echo of distant explosions. Kira stood at the edge of the high-rise observation deck, watching as fires raged in the distance. The air was thick with smoke, and the oppressive silence of the moment felt like a warning. This was the beginning of something darker than they had ever imagined. She clenched her fists, her fingers trembling slightly. Was this what they had fought for? A broken world, scarred beyond recognition, or a new beginning? The lines between right and wrong had blurred long ago, and she was no longer certain where they stood. How did we get here? She asked herself quietly. The question hung in the air, unanswered. There was no going back. Behind her, the hum of machinery and low voices brought her back to the present. The war room was alive with activity, but for Kira, it all felt distant, disconnected. She had always believed in the ideals they fought for. She had believed that they could rebuild. But with every decision, every step toward victory, the cost grew higher. "Commander," Magnus's voice interrupted her thoughts. He stood at the entrance, his broad frame casting a long shadow over the floor. His face was drawn, his eyes tired, but there was a resolve in them that Kira envied. She turned to face him. "What's the situation?" Her voice was steady, but beneath it, she could feel the weight of her doubt creeping in. "We've lost contact with the Eastern Front," he said, his voice low, as if the very words carried a heaviness that would crush anyone else. "The Deathworlders have broken through. We're not sure how much longer the Southern allies will hold." Kira nodded slowly. It was no surprise. The Deathworlders were relentless. They didn't care for alliances. Their only goal was domination. The fact that they had managed to survive as long as they had was a testament to their resourcefulness and cruelty. "And what about us?" Kira's mind raced, but the question felt pointless. She already knew the answer. They were losing. Magnus stepped closer, his tone softer now. "We can still fight. We can still win, Kira. But we need you to make the call. The Council is waiting for your orders." The pressure of leadership was like a weight on her chest. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, and her heart was torn between two opposing forces, duty and morality. The rebellion had once been about freedom, about standing up against tyranny, but the longer they fought, the more their cause seemed to shift. What had they become? "How many more have to die?" Kira whispered, more to herself than to Magnus. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. They both knew that the number of casualties would continue to climb until the last breath of the war was taken. Kira turned back to the window, looking out at the scarred cityscape. Was this worth it? She had lost friends, family, allies. The faces of the dead haunted her, their names carved into her memory. But the rebellion couldn't stop now. If they did, everything they had fought for would have been in vain. "Tell them I'll give my answer soon," she said, her voice steady again. Magnus nodded and left the room, but the silence that remained was deafening. It seemed to stretch on forever, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The following hours felt like a lifetime. Kira sat alone in the war room, the map of the conflict zone projected in front of her, but her eyes were unfocused. Her mind kept returning to the same place, the conversations she had had with her allies before the war, the promises made in the heat of battle, the ideals they had clung to so desperately. They had been so sure of themselves then. Maybe we were wrong, she thought. Maybe this is just how it always ends, a cycle of violence until there's nothing left to rebuild. Her fingers traced the map absently. The southern lines were holding for now, but Kira knew it wouldn't be enough. The Deathworlders were coming for everything. They didn't care for treaties, for promises, or even for the lives they destroyed along the way. They were relentless, like an unstoppable force of nature. But still, there was a part of Kira that couldn't let go. What if we could stop this, she thought. What if we could save something? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden crackle of the communication device. The screen blinked to life, revealing the face of a familiar figure, General Soren, one of her most trusted allies. "Commander, we need your decision," he said, his voice grim. "The Council is ready to move forward. We can't wait much longer." Kira's heart raced. The weight of her decision pressed down on her like a physical force. She had been given no easy choices, no way out. Every option led to more pain, more suffering. But there was something in her, some spark of defiance, that refused to give in. What would you do if faced with impossible odds? Would you take the risk? Her hand hovered over the comms panel, her mind racing through all the possibilities. The time for hesitation had passed. There was no turning back. "We'll fight." Her voice was firm, unwavering, as if speaking the words aloud would make them real. "We'll fight until we can't anymore." The words felt like a vow, a promise to those who had fallen. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the chance to rebuild, for the hope that there was something worth saving in the ashes. Enjoying this chapter? Don't forget to like and subscribe to HFY Genesis for more epic tales. The journey has only just begun, and the stakes are higher than ever. Stay tuned for the next chapter. The soft hum of the command room was drowned out by the weight of Kira's thoughts. The maps, sprawled across the table in front of her, seemed like abstract art now. Disconnected, cold, a constant reminder of the stakes. The rebellion had once been something to believe in, a cause worth fighting for. Now it was a series of desperate choices, each one leading to the same bitter conclusion: survival at any cost. "We can't keep this up," said General Voss, his voice breaking through her reverie. His graying hair looked out of place against his usual composed military demeanor. "We've lost the South, and our allies are pulling away. If we don't make a choice soon, we'll be overrun." Kira's fingers pressed against her temples, as though willing the pain away. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier. Every decision was a gamble. The rebellion was fragile, the alliances that held it together even more so. But the question remained: was it worth sacrificing more lives to hold on to a dying cause? Could she even live with that choice? She met Voss's eyes. The urgency in his gaze mirrored the tension gnawing at her insides. "Do we have any other options?" Kira's voice was low, almost a whisper, as if asking the question aloud would make it more real. The room fell silent. Everyone in it knew the truth. There was no other option. The Deathworlders' forces were advancing, and the hope that the Southern Alliance could hold had already crumbled. "We could surrender," suggested Lieutenant Maris, her voice cutting through the stillness. It was a radical proposition, one that Kira had been avoiding in her own mind. She could see the shock ripple through the room, even as she struggled to process it herself. "Surrender?" Kira snapped, the words leaving her lips sharper than she intended. "You think they'll let us live?" Maris didn't flinch. "Maybe. Or maybe we could broker some kind of peace." Kira turned away, her eyes landing on the damaged comm screen showing a patchy, flickering feed from their other bases. She could see the faces of those she once trusted, each one weary, scared, as exhausted as she felt. They were all waiting for her to make a decision. But how could she? How could she decide between the lives of those under her command and the people who had trusted her to lead them to victory? Her fingers hovered over the comms panel, as though it might offer an answer. But there was none. No comforting voice, no plan that could guarantee survival. The silence in the room stretched on. It was a silence heavy with unspoken thoughts, fears, and regrets. Everyone in the room was waiting. waiting for Kira to make the impossible choice. A cold chill ran down her spine. "What if the Deathworlders don't want to stop?" she whispered. "What if they don't care about peace? What if they've come to finish us off no matter what?" Voss met her gaze, his brow furrowed. "Then we fight." "But how much longer can we fight?" Kira asked, almost pleading. The thought of seeing another soldier fall, another innocent life wasted, broke something inside of her. She didn't want to be responsible for any more deaths. There it was again. The choice. Fight or surrender. One path would cost lives. The other, her dignity. The weight of command pressed down on her chest. Her heart beat painfully against her ribs. Kira stood up from the table abruptly, her legs shaky as she walked to the window. The view was the same as it had always been. Ruined streets, a city broken beyond recognition. But now, every crack, every wreckage felt personal. Each one was a reminder of her failure. "What if we're wrong?" she asked, the question directed more at herself than anyone else. "You're not wrong, Kira," Voss said, his voice softer now. "You're doing the best you can. We all are." But the words didn't help. They didn't make her feel any less alone. She turned back to the group, her decision still unmade. But she knew that time was running out. Every second she delayed meant more lives lost. "Gather the commanders," she said finally, her voice firmer now. "We're going to make a final push for the Western Front. We'll break through the Deathworlders' lines or die trying." The rebellion had been built on the idea of unity, a belief in fighting for something bigger than themselves. But now, as Kira looked around the room, she realized that unity might not be enough. There was no certainty, no guarantee. But sometimes, there was only the choice that had to be made. Would she ever feel ready for the consequences of this decision? Could she live with them? There was no going back now. Enjoying this chapter? Don't forget to like and subscribe to HFY Genesis for more epic tales. The sun had dipped low in the sky, casting the entire city in an amber hue that seemed to soften the jagged edges of war. But for Kira, standing at the precipice of a decision that could alter everything, the warmth was nothing but a cruel mockery of peace. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd behind her, her people, the ones who had rallied to her cause, the ones who believed in her vision of a world free from the tyrannical influence of the Empire. She had earned their trust, but the price of it was about to become unbearable. She turned, facing Voss and Maris. The weight of their eyes on her was heavy, both full of doubt, yet both unwilling to challenge her. They had trusted her too, but now they could see the cracks in her resolve. The decision before her had never been this clear. Forge ahead into battle, or find a way to pull back and try diplomacy. The rebels were ready. But were they truly ready for what would come next? What if we fail? Maris's voice was low, trembling, her eyes flickering between the faces of her comrades. What if we tear everything apart trying to build something new? Kira's hand tightened on the hilt of her blade, the symbol of resistance, of defiance, and yet, in that moment, it felt like nothing more than a tool of destruction. The rebellion was on the edge of something monumental, but so much stood in the way. Her heart ached with the responsibility pressing against her chest. "Maybe that's the point," Kira said, her voice steady but low. "Maybe it's about finding a way to break the cycle." "But at what cost?" Voss interrupted, his eyes hard. The man she had once thought a steady ally now seemed almost a stranger in the light of their new reality. Kira paused, her breath shaky. What was she doing? Could she honestly take another step forward knowing that this war could destroy the very thing they were fighting for? What if it was all too much? She remembered the faces of those who had fallen during the previous skirmishes, their deaths now a heavy burden on her shoulders. She had promised them a future that felt farther away with each passing moment. We fight for a new world, she said with a clarity she had not felt before. The words rang out, sharp and final, but deep down she knew that no matter what path she chose, some pieces of her would break. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. They wanted action. They wanted victory. The whispers of rebellion had been spoken too many times, and now they demanded their leaders make a stand. Voss stepped forward, his voice cold but resolute. "We'll follow you, Kira, but know this. Once we cross that line, there is no going back." Maris gave him a long look, the weight of their unspoken words hanging in the air. Her voice was quieter, but the desperation in it was palpable. "We've all lost so much. I just want to make sure we're not throwing away the last chance we have for something better." Kira closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The decision had to be made. And in that moment, her mind flashed back to her people. The children she had seen hiding in the streets, the families ripped apart by the Empire's cruelty. Every fiber of her being screamed for action. The rebellion had to move forward. "We strike at dawn," Kira declared, her voice full of resolve. But in the back of her mind, the question lingered. Was she truly ready to become the person they needed her to be? Could one choice, one battle, truly change everything? Would she ever see a future where peace was possible? Or had the world already passed the point of no return? As the leaders departed to prepare their forces, Kira's eyes turned toward the horizon. The weight of her decision rested heavily on her, but there was no turning back now. The time had come. The moon hung high in the sky, a pale witness to the secret preparations unfolding beneath its cold gaze. Kira stood before the map of the region, a strategic puzzle that had to be solved in mere hours. The rebellion was on the cusp of war, but what she and her comrades didn't know was that unseen forces had already begun to converge on them. "How much longer?" Voss asked, his voice low, a hint of impatience in his words. His hands were tense, clenching and unclenching around a weathered parchment detailing their assault strategy. The time for secrets was running out. "Just a few more days," Kira replied, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. The clock was ticking. The rebellion had to act swiftly, but each move was a gamble. Every action had consequences, and the weight of those consequences bore heavily on Kira's shoulders. Behind her, the men and women of the rebel forces were assembling, training, and fortifying their positions. Their eyes held determination, but there was an edge of fear too. The enemy was no longer just an abstract threat. It was coming, and when it did, would they be ready? Kira glanced at Maris, who was busy coordinating the logistics of weapon supplies and medics, her usually bright face drawn with worry. "We've received some reports of unusual troop movements from the Empire," Maris said, her voice steady, though it betrayed a flicker of doubt. "They're shifting resources. I fear they might be preparing to outflank us." A knot tightened in Kira's stomach. "What are our options?" "We could abandon our main offensive and try to hold our ground in the mountains," Voss offered. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the map. "But it would split our forces." "No," Kira cut him off sharply, her hand slamming onto the map. "We cannot retreat. Not now." She could feel the weight of all those lives behind her, those who had chosen to follow her, those who had already given everything. Could she, in good conscience, ask them to turn back now? Maris stepped closer, her eyes wide with concern. "Kira, the risk is too great. We're barely holding our ground as it is. If we're attacked from the north..." Kira raised her hand to silence her. "We won't run. We will stand. This is what we've been preparing for. The time for hesitation is over." But even as she said the words, doubt clung to her like a shadow. Had she truly prepared her people? Was this war something they could survive? Or was this the last desperate stand before the inevitable collapse? The ground beneath them trembled slightly. A distant rumble echoed through the camp, the sound growing louder. A messenger rushed into the tent, his face pale with fear. "Commander, the Empire's main force is marching toward us, far sooner than expected." Kira's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in months, she felt something resembling fear. But it was quickly replaced by the cold determination that had kept her moving forward. "Ready the troops," she commanded, her voice unwavering despite the storm raging within her. "Tell everyone to prepare for battle. This is it." As the messenger rushed away, Voss gave her a look. "You know this could be the end, don't you?" Kira met his gaze and nodded. "Yes, I know. But it's the only choice we have left." The rebellion had always been about more than just survival. It was about hope, about rebuilding a future. But how much of that future would be lost in the flames of war? For a brief moment, Kira allowed herself to wonder, would this be their rebirth? Or would this be their ruin? Maris approached her, her eyes soft with understanding. "Are you ready for this? To lead them into battle?" Kira took a deep breath. Her hands shook, but she clenched them into fists, feeling the cold steel of resolve settle in. "I am. And if we fail, it will not be because we didn't fight with everything we had." The weight of her words echoed through the camp, and Kira could see the effect it had on her soldiers. They were nervous, yes, but they were also emboldened by her conviction. She turned to face the rest of her commanders. "It's time." The dawn brought with it an unsettling quiet. The soldiers stood in formation, each one awaiting the signal to begin. The sky was heavy with the promise of war, and Kira couldn't help but wonder, what would they face beyond this battle? The sound of marching footsteps filled the air as the enemy forces drew closer. In the distance, a vast sea of soldiers moved like a dark tide, their armor glinting in the morning light. Kira stood tall, her heart racing, but there was no turning back now. The Empire had underestimated them before, but today they would show just how wrong they were. "All units prepare to move," she shouted, her voice carrying over the wind. The battle was about to begin. Enjoying this chapter? Don't forget to like and subscribe to HFY Genesis for more epic tales. The early morning fog hung thick over the rebel camp, shrouding everything in an eerie silence. It was as though the world itself held its breath, waiting for something dark to unfold. Kira stood at the edge of the camp, her mind racing, her heart heavy with a gnawing uncertainty that had taken root deep within her. For days, the war had raged. Blood had been shed, but victories had also been won, yet the cost of their success weighed heavily on her. And now, as the smoke of battle still curled in the distance, a whisper of suspicion echoed in her mind. She turned sharply as a messenger approached, his eyes wide with urgency. "Commander," he said, his voice trembling, "there's something you need to see." Kira's stomach clenched. Something in the messenger's tone spoke of dread. She followed him without a word, her boots sinking into the damp earth as they moved toward the command tent. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, ink, and tension. Voss and Maris stood by a table littered with maps and reports, their expressions grim. "What is it?" Kira asked, her voice low but forceful. Voss didn't look up at first. He was holding a piece of parchment in his hand, his knuckles white. "It's from our spies," he said. "It's about one of our own." A chill swept through Kira's body as her gaze darted to the document. Her worst fears were about to come true. There had been murmurs of betrayal for weeks now, subtle hints that not all was as it seemed. But Kira had dismissed them, unwilling to believe that anyone within their ranks could turn against them. Voss finally met her eyes, his voice heavy with accusation. "It's Darnell. He's been feeding information to the Empire." The words hit Kira like a blow to the chest. Darnell, the trusted second-in-command, the man who had stood by her side from the beginning, the one who had shared her vision of a new world. "But how?" Kira whispered, her mind reeling. "How could he?" Maris stepped forward, her face pale, her voice shaking. "We don't know yet, but we have proof. Evidence of messages sent to the Empire, coordinates, troop movements. He's been playing us all along." Kira's world seemed to spin. The one person she thought she could trust above all others had been feeding their enemies vital information, ensuring their every move was countered before they even made it. The rebellion was built on unity, trust, and loyalty. Without those, they were nothing. "What do we do now?" Kira's voice cracked, the weight of the question almost unbearable. Voss's jaw tightened. "We confront him. We can't let this stand." Kira shook her head, the conflicting emotions inside her nearly tearing her apart. A part of her wanted to rush into the heart of the camp, grab Darnell by the collar, and demand an explanation. But another part of her, a quieter, darker part, knew that no words would change what had already been done. She felt a deep pang of betrayal. It was more than just the tactical damage he had caused. It was the loss of a friendship, a partnership that had been forged in the fires of war. And yet, even as the anger burned, a cold, calculating voice in her mind urged her to think. No, to act. They couldn't afford weakness now. Kira turned to Voss. "Where is he?" "He's in the stockade," Voss replied, his face set in stone. "Good. We'll confront him there." But first, Kira hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision before her. "Gather the council. We need to decide our next move. The rebellion can't afford to fracture any further." As she left the command tent, Kira felt the eyes of her people following her every step. She could almost hear their whispers in the air. Who could they trust now? Who would be the next to betray them? The stockade was eerily silent as Kira approached, her footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. Darnell sat there, his face stoic, his eyes avoiding hers as she stepped into the dim light. He knew what was coming. Kira stood before him, her heart pounding. "You've been a traitor to everything we stand for, Darnell," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I trusted you. We all did." Darnell finally met her gaze, his face a mask of indifference. "Trust is a fragile thing," he said softly, his voice devoid of regret. "Sometimes it's just not worth holding on to." Kira's chest tightened. "Why? Why did you do this?" Darnell leaned back against the stone wall, his eyes cold. "Survival. Loyalty doesn't feed the hungry, Kira. It doesn't protect the weak. The Empire is power. I chose the side that would guarantee my survival. And yours, if I'm being honest." His words stung, but Kira forced herself to stand tall. She had known that the rebellion's cause was always fragile, but she had never imagined it would be torn apart by someone so close to her. "You should have known better," she said, her voice unwavering. "The Empire may promise safety, but it demands your soul in return. I'm not the one who's lost everything, Darnell. You are." His eyes flickered for a brief moment, but he said nothing. Later, after Darnell had been taken away and locked in a more secure holding cell, Kira stood alone outside the stockade, her breath visible in the cold morning air. The betrayal weighed heavily on her mind, but something else gnawed at her too. Had she missed something? Were there others? Was this the first crack in a much deeper conspiracy? For the first time, Kira questioned the foundation of everything she had built. Was it as solid as she thought? Or was it already crumbling beneath her feet? What would you do, faced with such deception? Would you trust again, or close yourself off entirely? The battlefield stretched before Kira like a dark ocean of smoke and fire. The ground trembled beneath her feet as explosions echoed in the distance, the heat from the flames licking the air around her. The rebellion's once hopeful camp was now a maze of makeshift defenses, hastily constructed barricades, and the desperate remnants of a force caught between survival and annihilation. Kira stood at the edge of the command post, her eyes scanning the horizon. The Empire had launched a full-scale assault, and there was no time left for second guesses or hesitation. The betrayal of Darnell still lingered in her thoughts, but now was not the time to dwell on it. Survival. That was all that mattered. She turned to her closest commanders, Voss and Maris, who stood by her side, their faces grim but resolute. The storm was coming, and they would have to weather it together. "All units are in position," Voss said, his voice steady despite the growing chaos around them. "The outer defenses are holding, but we don't have long. The Empire's main force is only an hour away." Kira nodded, clenching her fists. Every moment was a countdown. "We fight. We stand or we fall together. No matter what happens next, we do it for the future we've been building." Maris looked at Kira, her eyes filled with unspoken fears. "And what if we don't make it through this? What if—" "We will," Kira interrupted, her voice sharp. "Because we have to." But even as she said the words, Kira's mind was plagued by doubts. The rebellion had always been a fragile thing, held together by hope and unity, but the cracks were starting to show. Darnell's betrayal had torn a hole in their ranks, and the Empire's assault threatened to rip them apart entirely. Yet she could not allow herself the luxury of weakness. The first wave of Empire troops appeared over the ridge, a sea of black armor, their battle banners fluttering in the wind. They came with all the weight of Imperial might, a relentless tide of destruction. Kira's heart pounded in her chest. The battle was here. No more waiting, no more second chances. "Positions!" Kira shouted, her voice carrying over the battlefield. Her words cut through the rising chaos like a blade, and the rebellion's soldiers fell into formation with grim determination. The air was thick with tension, each warrior's gaze hardened with the same resolve. In the distance, the Empire's heavy artillery began to roll forward, their massive cannons aimed directly at the camp. There was no mistaking the purpose of this assault. It was an attempt to crush them once and for all. Kira looked back at the makeshift barricades that had been hastily erected in the last few hours. They were sturdy, but would they hold? She couldn't afford to wonder about that now. One battle at a time, one victory at a time. The rebellion had survived this long. It would survive this. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire erupted from the edge of the camp, followed by the sound of a man's desperate shout. Kira's head snapped toward the noise, her instincts kicking in as she rushed toward the danger. It was one of their scouts, a young soldier named Jace, who was pinned behind a rock, his arm clutching a bloody wound. His face was pale with pain, but his eyes burned with something deeper, fear, but also a kind of defiance. Kira knelt beside him, her heart sinking as she noticed the severity of his injury. "Jace." He looked up at her, his voice shaking. "The Empire. They're sending in snipers. We weren't prepared. They're everywhere." Kira's pulse quickened. The last thing they needed was the advantage of the Empire's elite marksmen. Her thoughts raced. How could they outmaneuver this? "Hold on," Kira said firmly. She called out to Maris, who was nearby. "Get the medics here, now." Maris didn't hesitate, but Kira had no time to dwell on Jace's fate. Her mind turned to the snipers. The rebellion's defenses were being systematically picked apart, one soldier at a time. "Voss, rally the sharpshooters. They need to clear the ridge. We need cover," she barked. Voss nodded and immediately moved to carry out the orders. There was no room for indecision now. As the battle escalated, the sounds of gunfire and explosions reverberated through the camp. The earth shook with the force of each blast. Kira's body was a blur of action as she commanded her forces with a precision born of necessity. Every decision, every order she gave could mean the difference between life and death for her people. And yet the more she commanded, the more she felt the weight of the rebellion's future pressing down on her shoulders. Through the smoke and fire, the Empire's assault continued. They were relentless, their forces seemingly endless, but Kira couldn't let herself falter. She fought through the fear that threatened to overtake her. Every explosion, every shriek of a falling soldier was a reminder of the stakes. Would they make it through this? Could they hold their ground against such overwhelming odds? Kira gritted her teeth. We have to. Hours passed, and the battle raged on. The rebellion held its ground, but barely. The Empire's forces were strong, their tactics calculated, their snipers devastatingly accurate. Kira could see her people beginning to waver, their resolve starting to crack under the weight of it all. Hold the line! Kira shouted again and again, her voice hoarse from the strain. She could hear the fear creeping into their responses, but she couldn't afford to acknowledge it. Not now. Just as hope began to slip through their fingers, a new sound reached her ears, thunderous, like the roar of an approaching storm. Voss appeared at her side, his face flushed with excitement. "Reinforcements!" he shouted, pointing toward the distant ridgeline. Kira's heart surged with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The last-minute reinforcements had arrived just in time. The tide of battle was about to change. Would you stand your ground in the face of certain destruction, or would you run when survival seemed impossible? As Kira watched her forces rally in the face of near-certain defeat, she realized that sometimes it wasn't about winning. It was about surviving and fighting for the future, no matter how slim the chance. The war was over, but the scars remained. Kira stood at the crest of the hill, gazing over the remnants of the battlefield. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the scene. The smoke from the previous day's conflict still lingered in the air, but there was something different now. The oppressive weight of the Empire's presence had lifted, replaced by a tentative silence that spoke of both loss and potential. The rebellion had triumphed, but at what cost? Thousands of lives had been lost, and countless more would bear the marks of this war for the rest of their lives. Yet in that moment, as the first light of a new day touched the earth, there was a sense of hope. Fragile, but unmistakable. Kira's heart still ached for the fallen, friends, comrades, loved ones. The faces of those who had sacrificed everything in the name of freedom haunted her thoughts. Yet, as she stared at the horizon, she understood that they hadn't died in vain. They had given their lives so that others might live in a world untainted by the Empire's tyranny. The rebellion's victory, though costly, had created a new path, one that would lead to a rebirth, to a future where the scars of the past might begin to heal. She closed her eyes, allowing the warmth of the sun to wash over her. This is only the beginning, she thought. We've won the war, but now we must rebuild. Her thoughts were interrupted as Voss approached, his footsteps heavy with weariness, but his expression resolute. He too had seen the costs of this war. He had lost as much as anyone, yet he remained. Kira. His voice was low, as if reluctant to break the peace that now hung in the air. We've lost so much, but we've won. Kira turned to him, meeting his gaze. We have, she said, her voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. But now the real work begins. Voss nodded, his eyes reflecting the weight of their shared responsibility. What's next? She paused, her mind racing with the complexities of the task ahead. We rebuild. We make sure the sacrifices of those we lost mean something. We show the galaxy that freedom doesn't come without cost, but that it's worth the price. But Kira knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding a shattered world was no simple task. The old empire had left a trail of destruction that would take generations to repair. The rebellion had won, yes, but the scars of war were deep. And the future was uncertain. What if there were forces beyond the empire, lingering in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike again? Kira couldn't afford to dwell on those questions right now. She had to focus on the present, on the people around her who had fought so valiantly. They needed leadership. They needed someone who could guide them through this fragile dawn. We'll need to unite the fractured systems, Kira said, the weight of the statement settling in. There are many factions out there still loyal to the old regime, still believing in its power. It won't be enough to simply defeat them on the battlefield. We'll need to win them over. We'll need to rebuild trust. Voss didn't say anything for a long moment, as if he were weighing her words carefully. Finally, he nodded. We've already started doing that, haven't we? Kira glanced around, seeing the scattered remnants of their forces. Soldiers, civilians, leaders, all working together to clear the debris of war, to salvage what was left. We've already begun, she thought, but it's just the beginning. The sun rose higher, illuminating the faces of the people who had fought and bled for this moment. Kira could see the hope in their eyes, even as they mourned. There was a sense of unity now, a shared purpose that transcended the individual. The rebellion had proven that unity could defeat the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever known. But unity alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild. Kira needed to confront the deeper issues that threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. How would they govern? How would they ensure that the new government wouldn't fall into the same traps of corruption and oppression as the old one? Kira knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed Voss, Maris, and the rest of her commanders to help her shape this new world. But more than that, she needed the people. The citizens who had supported the rebellion from the shadows, who had taken up arms when called, who had believed in the vision of a free galaxy. What about the people? Voss asked, reading the conflict in her eyes. What will we do for them? Kira turned to face him fully, her gaze intense. We make sure they're heard. We make sure their voices matter in the new government. No more rulers who decide from on high. No more oppression. Everyone deserves a say in their future. Voss nodded, his expression hardening with the conviction of someone who had seen the horrors of the old system. We'll make sure that happens. But as they stood there, gazing over the battlefield that would soon be their foundation, a lingering thought clawed at Kira's mind. Would they succeed? Could they rebuild a galaxy that had been torn apart for so long? She didn't know, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. Her people were counting on her. And no matter the challenges that lay ahead, Kira would face them head-on. What would you do if, given the responsibility of shaping a new world from the ashes of the old? Would you be able to keep the flames of hope alive? The story is end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to HFY Genesis for more epic tales.